Okay, so in this video I'll talk about configuring routes. Basically this is what I'm learning, and this is some nifty things about routing, which probably works the same way in MVC too, that causes a lot of confusion. So configuring routes is what we're going to be talking about. So unless the API is very simple, we will not use the default route, and I will go ahead and show this in the code. So in our WebAPI config is where we configure our routes, and here we have default API route. So instead of using this, we're going to use something better. This is typically used just for if it's just a very small API, but if you have something that's a little more complicated, we should create like its own route. So we give it a name, foods, or actually let's call it food, and then route template. Instead of having a controller here, we give it its own link, nutrition, food, and then ID. So it has its own route template, but then in defaults we do have to tell it what the controller is, and the controller is our food controller, actually foods in this project. Say controllers, foods controller, so this has to match. So let's go ahead and try to navigate to this route. So here it is. One thing that I just found out is this foods, although we are specifying controller name is foods, the link still has to be the same, it has to match. So you can name this something else, like a food, and controller foods, but the name obviously can be different, but these two have to match. So created this, and now we have a little bit more of a custom route. So basically what I just did, I segmented the route based on application needs. For a specific route, we define what the template for the route is going to be. So we segment the routes based on application needs. We can architect this to better fit our application needs. So in this case, nutrition is one part of our application, so we want to create its own route template here. In addition to routes, we have constraints. For a specific parameter constraint, what parameter is going to look like. By default, it's, for example, integer. It will be automatically constrained by the framework to integer, and it's much more important if you're using like a string parameter. So here we can set up the constraint for our parameter. We can create new anonymous type, and we can create a constraint, for example, for ID, and then we will put some constraint here. But since ID is as an integer, like I said, it's already been constrained to only numbers, integer numbers, by the framework. And then we can go ahead and remove our default route. We don't really want it. Another big thing, very confusing, is the parameter mapping. So we define it in the routing, and it has to match the parameters in action methods. So parameter mapping is defined here. So if you have food ID here, this has to be food ID, because obviously we have to make it optional. But also here in our controller, food ID, and then obviously we have to change this to food ID. But this parameter here has to match the name that we also the same name that we name it in our route template. Another huge thing is working with the query strings. If you have a query string and we didn't do anything to accept it, you know, the API framework is going to ignore it. I mean, we could parse it, the query string from HTTP request, and do some things with it, but we also have WebAPI has mappings built for query string. We can define it in the get and use it to specify the behavior of the method. So for example, here in a controller we can go ahead and define a boolean include measures, and we can make it to default to true, include measures, and then in our link here, if we have a query string after foods and we call it include measures, it's not going to do anything now because we're setting it, we're really not doing anything in a code. But if we put this include measures query string to false, then in the code what we can do, we can based on this condition we can display either all the foods with measures or just all the foods without a measures. Like all the foods without a measures could be used for like a drop down list or something. So in order to do this, we can go ahead, and this is also very interesting, we create a query, iQueryable. We just create like a query variable of food, call it query, and you can say if include measures is true, then we say query, we assign it to query, we just say repository get all foods with measures, and that's it, that's our query. Else our query is the one down here, repository will get, I mean not that, the one up there is the one down here, it's repository get all foods. And we have a query, so we go ahead and assign it to our result. So instead of doing this, we say query dot order by and then return the result. So now if include measures is true, it will return foods with measures. If it's not, it will return just the foods. So let's see if that works. So here we have include measures, I'm setting false, so there's no measures. If I return true, there are measures. Very powerful technique. So those are some of the tools and nifty things that we can do with our routing, how we should set it up, you know, to be more specific for our app and not really use the default route. Then parameter mapping and even query string mapping that we can use in our application, in WebAPI application. It's very nifty and very crucial and important skill to know.